On my cancelled Dreamcast games video, Apple Arcade 120 commented asking if I'd made one on cancelled Nintendo 64 games. Well, I have now. My relationship with the Nintendo 64 is an unusual one. I had the console back in the 90s and loved it, but there are very few games on the system that I actually like. If it wasn't for Rare, I probably wouldn't have ever bought one, but games like Diddy Kong Racing and GoldenEye made it a must-have console for me, and GoldenEye remains one of my all-time favourite games. Most of the console's games, however, didn't do much for me, with even fan favourites like the Ocarina of Time missing the mark. Let's find out if that library of games could have ended up being better, as we take a look at 25 of the Nintendo 64 games that never were. Before it moved to the GameCube and became Star Fox Adventures, Rare were developing Dinosaur Planet for the N64. It was to be Rare's last hurrah on the console, in development around 1999 and 2000. When Shigeru Miyamoto saw Dinosaur Planet, he immediately noticed the resemblance the game's protagonist Saber had to Star Fox's Fox McCloud, and so asked Rare to convert the game into a Star Fox launch title for the GameCube. From what's known of Dinosaur Planet's gameplay and story, it seems that little was changed in that respect, but sources have claimed that several interesting features were dropped from it when it became Star Fox Adventures. The original name was even retained in a way, as the characters in Star Fox refer to the planet on which the adventure takes place as Dinosaur Planet. Robotech Crystal Dreams was a planned N64 space combat simulator based on the Robotech anime from the mid-80s after GameTech bought the rights in 1994. First officially announced in May 1995 as Robotech Academy, it was initially to be a battle simulator, but early on in 1996 the focus shifted towards making a space combat simulator and the name changed to Robotech Crystal Dreams. Rather ambitiously, Robotech boasted an entire solar system to explore and an open-ended structure to the missions, allowing the player greater freedom. The story is based around events from the anime and follows Carl Bartley, a disgraced Defence Force pilot come mercenary who's fighting to protect the Earth from a new alien threat. Several weapons, characters and vehicles from the anime were to also be present. GameTech received a lot of support from Nintendo, including assistance with getting to grips with the new N64 hardware, but sadly they filed for bankruptcy in 1997 when the game was still incomplete, although 90% finished. GameTech continued to try to find a publisher willing to pick up Battletech but were unsuccessful, scrapping the project entirely just days after it was shown at 1998's E3. Mother 3, aka Earthbound 64, was announced for the N64 in 1996. Development quickly moved to the N64 disk drive, but even then the team ran into some issues due to hardware limitations, and reportedly due to the N64's hardware being rather difficult to program. The team's inexperience with developing 3D games certainly didn't help either. When the 64DD was a complete flop, Mother 3 was cancelled in August 1997. The game was reborn in 2003 when development began for a Game Boy Advance version of Mother 3, which was released in 2006. Metroid 64, as it was rumoured to be called, was seemingly cancelled before it even began. The game has been mentioned several times, despite development never even starting. An N64 sequel to the popular Super Metroid was a no-brainer, and fans of the franchise were begging for it, but a solid concept for the game couldn't be agreed upon. Sakamoto, Super Metroid's director, said in an interview with Games that he couldn't envisage a 3D Metroid game working with the N64 controller. Nintendo approached another developer at the time, but they too turned it down, feeling doubtful that they could make a good enough N64 Metroid game that could live up to Metroid's high standards. For that reason, Metroid fans had to wait until the GameCube to get their wish. Echo Delta was to be a real-time strategy for the N64 with some action game and RPG elements. The game's objective was to use a submarine to retrieve a sunken ship. The sub collects energy from the ocean floor, which can subsequently be used to upgrade the sub. Echo Delta was almost completed but was cancelled in 2000, and a prototype was bought on eBay in 2006, and since then an 18-minute demo has surfaced. Freakboy was an action-adventure game with puzzle elements, developed by Virgin's in-house team Burst, and was to be the first N64 game published by Virgin. It was first presented at 1996's E3 and had a planned release date in early 97. It starred the titular Freakboy, who could integrate the environment into his body in order to gain new abilities and weapons, which could be used to solve various puzzles in order to protect the planet Hedron from interdimensional aliens. Freakboy promised a lot, a quote, unique visual experience, using advanced 3D technology and offering multiple viewpoints. After being rebuilt from scratch twice, the game was eventually abandoned altogether. In a bizarre stroke of luck, a prototype of Freakboy was bought at a car boot sale in Guildford in 2015 from a seller who was seemingly clueless as to its significance, and some low quality footage of said prototype has been uploaded. It's hard to tell whether Freakboy would have been any good, but the gameplay mechanic of assimilating the environment with the protagonist's body parts is certainly an interesting one. Literally nothing exists of Super Mario 64 2 to show you, but I thought it was worth mentioning anyway. It was in development for the N64 disk drive and was obviously a planned sequel to the N64's hugely successful Super Mario 64, but was cancelled early on due to the system's commercial failure. A demo level was reportedly created, but Nintendo has released nothing at all on the game. Rumour has it that Luigi was to appear in the sequel, as Miyamoto planned for it to be multiplayer, and that Yoshi would also be mountable in-game. Any other information such as the in-game power-ups etc. are unknown, but it's thought that some of the game's elements may have bled into Mario's subsequent games, Sunshine and Galaxy. Again, not much on this one, as all that exists of Lethal Encounter is a 1998 article from Edge magazine. Being developed by British studio Digital Image Design, well known for their PC flight sims, Lethal Encounter was to be a flight simulator for the N64 with a plot based around an alien invasion. In late 1998 their publisher Ocean was bought out by Infogrames, and several key Lethal Encounter's team members left as a result. Although Digital Image Design didn't shut up shop entirely, Lethal Encounter became a casualty of the buyout and was never released. Velvet Dark was to be a follow-up to Rare's acclaimed N64 first-person shooter Perfect Dark, this time starring Joanna Dark's sister Velvet, which started development shortly after Perfect Dark was completed. Beyond being a playable character in Perfect Dark's co-op and multiplayer modes, very little of Velvet's persona is known, but we do know that Velvet Dark was planned as a third-person stealth action game rather than a first-person shooter. This decision seems to be partly due to Rare wanting to expand their horizons in that respect, and also Nintendo wanted to bring a few more third-person games to the N64, perhaps due to the success of games like Tomb Raider and Metal Gear Solid. Also of note is that Rare were keen to test some new motion capture technology, and a third-person game was the ideal playground in which to do so. Sadly, very little exists of Velvet Dark beyond some concept art and a design document, despite Rare having reportedly worked on the concept for around a year. Jungle Bots was a planned first-person shooter starring, as the name suggests, robotic jungle animals. Said to have been cancelled midway through development by its publisher Titus, Jungle Bots was plagued with issues during the development process. The devs struggled to work with the cartridge format of the N64, and surprisingly the team had never made a game before, instead having experience in only making theme park attractions. Only some screenshots, concept art and a concept trailer exist. Wild Waters, also known as Extreme Kayak and X-Stream during development, was a whitewater canoe racing game being developed by Looking Glass Studios and published by Ubisoft. Wild Waters caused some hype when it was announced in 1999, as the devs created an engine which, at the time at least, had pretty impressive physics for the running water. It was to feature 5 gameplay modes: Arcade, Time Trial, Championship, Finals and Versus Battle. In May of 2000, not long after it was first announced, Looking Glass went bust and the unfinished Wild Waters died along with them. From a design document for Race and Chase, the original planned title for DMA Design's Grand Theft Auto, we can see that an N64 port was planned. All that seems to be available is a Spanish magazine article, but it's uncertain if these screenshots are actually from an N64 version in development. I'm not sure why GTA never came to the console, but knowing Nintendo's attitude towards video game violence, I'm surprised it was even a consideration to begin with. Vampire Circus was an ambitious Gauntlet-style game starring a host of B-movie monsters, being developed by Z2. All that seems to remain is some concept art of the characters, but the game was to allow the player to control one member of a party of 5, with the other 4 being controlled by AI. The player could switch between the 5 characters, granting access to each's unique abilities. Z2 had a working prototype, but Vampire Circus then became another victim of the Infogrames buyout of Ocean, who were to publish the game. The team working on Vampire Circus were then made to work with Warner Brothers, and the project morphed into Taz Express. Blades of Passage, also known by the codename Project Edge, was a planned action RPG for the 64DD and was intended to feature in the North American launch lineup. It was said to expand on the concepts of Secret of Mana, but in 3D. Richard Knight, one of the developers at Pixel Play Interactive, said that when he came to the project it was in a state of limbo, as Nintendo had already postponed this 64DD's American launch. All ongoing projects were instructed to transition to development for the upcoming GameCube, but Blades of Passage was scrapped. Pixel Play Interactive became Orbital Media soon afterwards, and Game Boy Advance development hardware was brought in to replace the Nintendo 64 tech. Apart from a handful of low-res screenshots, all that remains is a demo reel from David Richardson, who also worked on the game. Thornado, also known as Turrican 64, was a third-person action shooter in development by Factor 5. Although known as Turrican 64, it was more of a spiritual successor, and it doesn't resemble Turrican at all from what I can see. It was planned to be called Turrican 64, but Factor 5 couldn't secure the rights. Thornado had a planned 8 levels and also 2 playable characters from which to choose, a male and a female. It was to also feature an original soundtrack from legendary video game composer Chris Hulsbeck, who composed the scores for the original Turrican games. Due to Factor 5 being busy working on Rogue Squadron for the N64 and a few other delays, Thornado was pushed back to the GameCube and then cancelled altogether. Viewpoint 2064 was to be an isometric shooter in the Viewpoint series for the N64. After porting the 1992 Neo Geo original to the PlayStation and Saturn, Sammy began working on an N64 version, which was to be a sequel. Viewpoint 2064 had the camera to the rear of the ship, much like in Star Fox, in addition to the isometric aspect of the original. It was cancelled due to reported developmental problems, but a playable prototype emerged on eBay in 2015. Another one from Looking Glass Studios here, Mini Racers was to be a multiplayer racing game in which up to 4 players drive remote controlled cars, and looks like it had a lot in common with Micro Machines. It had several single and multiplayer game modes and a track editor, and also had several camera angles from which to view the track. Not sure why this was cancelled, but a playable beta was leaked online in 2012. A shame, as this one looks like it would have been a welcome addition to the N64's library, and I'm quite partial to these fun multiplayer races. Contra Spirits 64 was a planned entry in the Contra series for the N64, but not much information exists on this apart from a few mentions in magazines. It was to be a 3D side-scrolling run and gun, but the camera angle would switch or move behind the player's character during boss battles or set pieces. Due to the console's lackluster sales in Japan, Konami binned the project. 64 Wars was to be a Nintendo 64 entry in the Advanced Wars series, or Famicom Wars if you're in Japan. The Advanced Wars games on the Game Boy Advance are my favourites on the handheld and among my all-time favourite games. If you haven't played them, they're turn-based military strategy games with a cutesy cartoony visual style. 64 Wars was being developed by Hudson rather than Intelligent Systems, but we can see from the screenshots that the gameplay and visual style is very similar to the other entries in the series, with manoeuvres being displayed on a 2D map and battles in 3D cutscenes. All that exists are screenshots from Japanese magazines, and no playable demo ever surfaced. Perhaps most interestingly, 64 Wars was to integrate with Game Boy game Game Boy Wars 2, which was also developed by Hudson. The games could connect via the transfer pack used with Pokemon Stadium, allowing for the continuation of a game on either console. Game Boy Wars 2 was a Japanese exclusive, so I'm unsure if 64 Wars was to be the same. For whatever reason it was cancelled, although some have speculated that it was due to brand quality disagreements between Hudson and Intelligent Systems. If you haven't played Advance Wars on the Game Boy Advance, I can't recommend it enough. Rev Limiter is an interesting one, and it was promoted a great deal and was in development for the 64DD from Seta Corporation. An arcade racer which was to be the console's answer to Ridge Racer, Rev Limiter started its life on the 64DD but was moved back to the N64. Several screenshots exist which do look stunning for an N64 game to be fair, and a playable prototype does exist on which the owner made this video. Several delays eventually led to Rev Limiter's cancellation, but it remains one of the more intriguing unreleased games for the system. Carnival A was to be a game based on the not so well known animated film of the same name, which had limited release in 2000 and was created by former Tim Burton art director Dean Taylor. It was to stick to the premise of the film. A group of kids are trapped in an amusement park in another dimension, and the player can partake in several mini-games, hunt for collectibles, as well as playing the standard adventure mode. A Mario Kart style racing mode was also planned. As well as following the game's plot, the footage available, although poor, shows that the game was sticking to the art style of the film. A rough build of Carnival A was shown at 1999's E3, but reorganisation at the developer led to the game's cancellation. A playable prototype emerged in 2009. Dragon Sword was a cooperative hack and slash adventure game announced in early 1998 from Blitz Games, who also created Glover. Set in the fictional Avantaria, Dragon Sword saw a group of 4 heroes battling to thwart the plans of an evil mage, and was a heavily action-focused game with adventure elements. My initial thought on seeing its gameplay was how similar it was to Gauntlet Legends on the Dreamcast, and subsequently read on Unseen 64 that its gameplay was actually designed to be very similar to Gauntlet Legends 64. The 4 selectable characters each had their own unique abilities and attacks, and up to 2 players could play cooperatively at one time, and also had a 4-player deathmatch mode. Despite being more or less complete, Dragon Sword was canned when publisher MGM decided that there wasn't enough money in it. 64 Magazine loved the game so much when they played it, they not only scored it 93% but started a petition to persuade MGM to publish it. This was sadly a fruitless endeavour, and Dragon Sword fell into obscurity until 2010 when a playable beta was leaked online. Jest was a planned action platformer being developed by Curve Logic, in which Jax, a Joker, endeavours to become a fully fledged jester. To be fair, the available footage looks awesome, although pretty poor resolution, with gameplay and graphics reminiscent of Mario 64 or other great Nintendo 64 era 3D platformers. Not sure of the details regarding Jest's cancellation, but sure enough it was scrapped and Curved Logic shut their doors. If there's one game on this list that immediately grabbed my interest, it's Toon Panic. The reason being that A, its character concept designs are beautifully drawn and seem really unique, and B, the gameplay clearly resembles Power Stone. Power Stone, a fast-paced 3D fighting game, was one of my first experiences on the Dreamcast, and fuck me, it's good fun. It was cancelled when developer Bottom Up went bust, and I'm unsure of how far along in development the game was. A pretty bare bones prototype was sold in Japan before being leaked online in 2008. What a shame, as Toon Panic looks like jolly good fun, and this sort of party-based fighting game was well suited to the console. Tamiya Racing is an unreleased game for the N64 which had many similarities to the previously mentioned mini racers, again having gameplay akin to Micro Machines. Incidentally, when the prototype of this game was sold, the listing mentioned that the game was developed by Intermetrics, who are associated with Looking Glass Studios who develop mini racers. All that seems to exist of the game is some images of said prototype and some gameplay from it. So that was an extra long episode of cancelled games featuring 25 of the most interesting unreleased Nintendo 64 games. Let me know if you think any of them look particularly good, and as always, thanks for watching.